Hello, everyone. My name is Nicolaas van Wyk. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Chartered Institute for Business Accountants, and I'm also the editor for Accounting Weekly. It's the publication of our professional body, and we focus specifically with Accounting Weekly on the news trends and technical articles for accountants in practice, accountants and tax practitioners in practice, and we then include a podcast section within Accounting Weekly where we speak with technical experts, um, stakeholders, CIPC and SARS, uh, influential people from overseas impacting the profession. But then also we want to move closer to engaging with the academia. And today I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Grietjie Verhoef as our next interviewee for Accounting Weekly podcast. Professor Verhoef is a professor at University of Johannesburg, and she specializes in accounting, economic, and business history. And our interest developed, and how I found Professor Verhoef was we were doing a SIBA, a bit of an economic overview, and we wanted to understand better the future of accountancy. We know there's all this technology developing with AI, there's legislative changes, there's the South African Qualifications Authority really looking at professional bodies and designations. And this process of developing our future outlook, our plans for the future, I thought let's also then first consider and set a good foundation. And that is then always history. So you cannot navigate the future if you don't know where you came from. And it plots you nicely in your mind so that you know where you are. And then it also invigorates you. But of course, what you find is that the history repeats itself. And the struggles that you might be experiencing, either as an accounting practitioner or as a professional body, the CEO of a professional body, you have some allies. And those allies, they might not live anymore because they lived 50 or 100 years ago, but they went through the similar struggles. And there was two specific publications by Professor Verhoef that I found very interesting and wanted to share with our Accounting Weekly readers and the broader accounting market, because I think it really deserves much more awareness. The first one was on the history of the accountancy profession in South Africa from 1904 to 1951, really shaping the shaping period for the profession. There's so much history to unlock. There's just to plot ourselves. It's let's say it's 1899. The Boer War starts. You can even make it go further when the British colonized, and maybe before that, even when the Brits were here, after the Netherlands governed parts of South Africa, and then something happens in 1910. South Africa becomes a union. Later on, leaves the Commonwealth, gets to be a republic, have a apartheid regime that governs for 30 years, and then 1994 happens. So that history, I think we all know in a broad timeline, and we might know some about economics, but what about our own profession during this time? And it's when I read Professor Verhoef's articles, I suddenly realized, but we all talk about decolonizing our minds and decolonizing Africa, and there's a resurgence in African identity with the African Union and Africa Free Trade Agreements. And we also see, likewise, developments in Asia, with China asserting itself as a prominent player in world history. Then we see the West, led by the US, wanting to retain its dominance. And if you broadly consider the economic systems, you do find economic structures, for example, the World Bank, the SWIFT payment system, all there to support the economic system. But when there's new players finding their voice and identity, then these structures, I suppose, need to also be reconsidered and see how you can influence them better to service your own economies. And if you go one step lower, you would find that these institutions are supported by standards. And one of these group of standards is then the IFRS Foundation setting IFRS. And that set of standards is utilized by accountants within countries. So there's a direct correlation between an economic system and structures and the standards deployed to maintain those systems, and what you do as an accountant on your day-to-day life. So you might have a close corporation, a company, a trust, and you file these things, or you prepare them in terms of a financial reporting standards. And then I know we do them for our clients to make economic decisions. That's one element of it. But if you just sit back, have a whiskey, and just think one day, where do these things come from? And then you start deconstructing them, and you suddenly find yourself in history. And this is then where a professor like Professor Verhoef becomes like a shining light to guide your thinking and your path, to understand how IFRS can be used to benefit or harm a country, whether you should adopt it fully or only partially, whether you should give yourself exemptions and apply it a bit differently. And then suddenly you see a lot of new options for your own members and your accountants as they prepare financial statements. Now, all that is because of Professor Verhoef's article. And I don't know whether she knows this, but she lit a fire, and this fire is now starting to burn. And we'll see how far we can get this new movement going. So that is the introduction to SIBA and why we're today talking with Professor Verhoef. But now let me then ask Prof. Verhoef to give a brief overview of her own career development and why she's interested in accounting history and where she's currently finding herself. Welcome, Professor Verhoef.
Thank you very much, Nicolaas. I started my studies at the Rand Afrikaanse Universiteit in Johannesburg and did my undergraduate and postgraduate work there with a PhD in the history of Nedbank, where the focus was on the influence of the Netherlands banking tradition in the banking environment in South Africa, which was very much dominated by the British banks. And from there on, I continued work on the insurance industry with specific focus on the long-term insurer Sanlam and the entire complex of insurance development within that group. And subsequently, in the Department of Accountancy, I was asked to do an overview of the development of the accounting profession in South Africa, which then led me to more in-depth work on the accounting profession. And for the first time, a historian has used the historical documents of the associations that finally became SAICA to explain exactly what had happened on the ground as the profession progressed. And all of this occurred within the context of South Africa's economic development. So there's actually no way that you can separate business, accounting, and economic history from each other. They are intertwined. But unfortunately, our scholars at the accounting departments focus very much on the technical stuff and give attention to the broader context of the other systems developing around them within which they practice their expertise. So that's how I became involved in this research.
It's so interesting, and you've raised so many interesting points. I think the one would be the comment you made on technically focused. When we engage with our own regulators, whether it's the IRBA or the Financial Reporting Standards Council, you can clearly see the focus is on technical aspects, which is very important, and you have to be accurate and present information in a way that's understandable and useful. So nobody doubts that. But the technical stuff isn't the only thing that you need to know about. Because, as you said, they support an economic system. And
Yes.
I think I first became aware of it when I was still a technical executive at the professional bodies. That's kind of my history. And we had to make submissions on company law. And as a technical astute person, I just started writing technical commentary. And then one day I woke up and I said, but why am I writing this? What is informing my thinking? And then what I do not see in the accounting profession is the framework within which you would write your technical article. And that framework should be the history of your own economic development and then the economic policy set by Parliament for our country. So we cannot make standards if it doesn't support the economic policy that Parliament has approved. Otherwise, we would act outside of Parliament. And when I started thinking that, I think I discovered an article from a research article on how India approaches IFRS development. And their first starting point is, does this standard support our economy? And then they would make changes or exemptions. And I found similar things in China, but looking at South Africa, I would see we would just follow the UK, whatever the UK would advise or adopt or influence within the IFRS Foundation. We kind of follow suit, and then you can see countries following into sectors with the UK, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, a certain paradigm, and then there's different ones. So just having different paradigms was an eye-opener for me. But coming back to your specific research, it is so interesting. I think you chose your topic starting in 1904 to 1951. What I found particularly interesting, and readers can access your research if they type in the history of the accounting profession and your name, Professor Grietjie Verhoef. I think that's how I got it on a PDF. That there was so much political maneuvering in getting the upper hand, basically because it has economic benefit, and then from there it shapes the development profession. But you did the research. Can you provide us with like an overview and the interesting bits of your research, and I suppose your sources also? Where did you find your sources? How did you shape this research of yours?
Yeah. So let me talk about the sources first. There were some primary minute books of the accounting associations held in some of the offices of the accounting organizations in the 4 provinces, in Natal, the Free State, Transvaal, and the Cape. But it was never together. And then eventually, when the project was started to look at the history of the accounting profession, we pull all of that together into the accounting archives at the University of Johannesburg. And my colleagues and I went to the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales in London, where we collected extensive sources from that archive, because the ICAEW in London has a wonderful living library and archive, and they have kept sources on the development of the accounting organizations in South Africa, of which many of their members were also members. So the first point is keeping the sources separately and putting them together in an archive was a major project that enabled systematic research. And unfortunately, very few accounting academics in South Africa visit that accounting research deposit at the University of Johannesburg and work through those sources to understand the process development. So that's the basic starting point, the original sources. And you cannot write in ideology into the sources. You read what the people wrote in the minutes, and those are the facts that you deal with. So we started off with that. And I say that because I had 2 colleagues who worked with me. They did not finish PhD studies, but they did systematic work that enabled me to finish my project. So then, let's just have a look at what happened in South Africa from 1904 onwards. Now, 1904 is not really the right date yet. In 1895, British accountants who were working in the colony of Natal established the Institute of Accountants in Natal. And through developments, finally they established the Chartered Accounting Association in Natal with the sanctioning of the Natal Parliament. Remember, we had 4 different colonial parliaments. So in Natal, only in 1905 did they have an organization that was sanctioned by their government, that we say statutory sanctioning. In 1904, the accountants working in the Transvaal, that was Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek of President Kruger, then the Second War of Independence against the British, and then we became the Transvaal colony under Lord Milner. So in prior to the Anglo-Boer War in 1895 already, the accountants who were working in the Transvaal tried to get sanctioning from the Kruger government, but failed to get that because the war broke out. And they bedeviled their attempt by their active support for the Jameson raid in 1896. So many of the leading accountants in the Transvaal were members of Jameson's raid and they ended up in jail. So then, their cause was lost. And after the war, they picked it up. Then they had a British administration in Transvaal. And then finally they succeeded in 1904 in establishing the Transvaal Society of Accountants, TSA, and that had statutory sanctioning in the Transvaal Parliament under the British. And a similar thing then happened in the Free State and in the Cape. Also in the Cape, long before the early 1900s, there were organizations of accountants, but they weren't given any statutory sanctioning by the colonial government in the Cape. The important point is that accountants are professionals and they try to protect their professional domain. And the protection of the professional domain meant that they wanted some people to be allowed to continue with that practice and other people to be disallowed. And at that point, you had several groups of accountants working in the 4 British colonies. You had people who were members of the British Chartered Institute, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, ICAEW. They were chartered because the British monarch gave them a charter to acknowledge them as professional accountants. In Britain, there was also the Society of Independent Accountants and Auditors, the SIAA, and they did not have the Royal Charter. So the SIAA accountants in Britain were very unhappy with the fact that they were not chartered, but the other group were chartered. So many of the accountants finally ending up in colonies, both in South Africa and Australia and in New Zealand, were SIAA members and not members of the Chartered Society. So there was a very strong motivation by the SIAA members to protect their turf, their professional domain, where else they operated in the colony. So they started activities and actions to get the colonial governments to sanction their professional domain. So that finally led to the passing in 1904 in the Transvaal of the Transvaal colonies sanctioning those accountants. And then it was clear that only accountants who were members of that society were allowed to practice as professional accountants in the Transvaal. And they did exactly the same in the Free State, in Natal, and in the Cape at different stages. But now remember, those societies, the Transvaal TSA, Transvaal Society, the CSA, the Cape Society, the NSA, Natal Society, and the Free State Orange River Society of Accountants, they were just called accountants, and their statutes determined who were permitted to practice as accountants. And then in 1910, the accountants realized that now there is a different political dispensation. What they then tried to do is get a union-wide sanctioning. But the bickering between these societies, you can't imagine. The Cape Society had members who were not permitted to practice in the Transvaal because they didn't qualify in terms of the Transvaal requirements to become an accountant. So the Transvaal people were not happy to have all the Cape people joining one specific body. Finally, in 1927, they realized that their bickering wasn't taking them anywhere. The government was not supporting any of their initiatives to get accounting sanction in the union. And then they succeeded with a private statute, not a statute by the government, but a private statute. You have two different statutes in any dispensation, one initiated by the ruling party and one that is a private motion in a parliament. So they then succeeded with a private motion 27 to pass the Designation Act. And that caused havoc in the RCAEW camp in the UK, because the Designation Act in 27 gave the accountants who were permitted to practice in terms of the statutes of the 4 different society statutes the title Chartered Accountant. So you can understand that the professional competition was really in the background of this decision. Remember, most of those accountants working in South Africa were SIAA members. And those are the people in the UK who did not get the chartered designation in the UK because the ICAEW's members got that designation. So in the end, the ICAEW people objected. They even went to the British Parliament.
Hi, Nicolaas. She has disconnected for a second, I'll admit. Okay.
Was that the South Africans?
So, Prof, sorry, Prof, we just lost you there. We just lost you when you said you wanted to say the Parliament, and then you can continue from that sentence.
The South African Parliament passed a private act, the Designation Act. So it was initiated by the societies, which gave the accountants in South Africa the title Chartered Accountant. And that was opposed by the ICAEW in London. They tried to get the Privy Council, which is the highest judicial council in the UK, to nullify the South African Act. The Privy Council, of course, said it's not within their jurisdiction. They couldn't do that. But then the South Africans had a title, Chartered Accountant, similar to those in the UK, who had the real royal charter from the monarch, from the king. So the South African accountants were systematically from 1904 onwards instituting processes to protect their professional domain in South Africa. And the Designation Act in 2027 just gave them the title, but not yet the absolute single right to practice. In South Africa, you had, well, this was the case in all the British colonies. You had accountants from the entire spectrum of accounting practice. You had municipal accountants. You had the London Society of Accountants. You had a whole plethora of accountants coming to the colonies and trying to establish themselves there as accountants. And then you had this competition between all the accountants, for some of them trying to seek the upper hand. Now, the reason why they sought the upper hand was that some accountants argued you have to have professional standards. You've got to be a professional accountant. You have to have certain knowledge. You have to understand the processes, what is acceptable and what not. You have to have the correct training. So you have to spend so many years in clerkship. So all of that is a set of requirements controlling entry. The academics talk about barriers to entry, and that is correct. the professional accountants were carving out systematically a set of barriers to entry into the profession and therefore be allowed to work on public and private accounting reporting. They were trying to set that up to protect their professional domain. And on the outskirts, you had a large number of other people doing some kinds of accounting work, bookkeeping, and so forth, but not the real professional thing. So that was the very long, extended, prolonged battle between people doing things in accounting in South Africa. The change came in 1944 when the Minister of Finance then said, well, I think I've had enough of this fight within the profession. Now, since it's obvious to me that you cannot agree, I will, from the state side, with a public act, seek to introduce an accounting statute that would regulate the profession and determine who can practice and who may not practice. That eventually, now remember I said 1944, that's even before that the National Party took control of the country in 1948. It was also 44, which is prior to the end of the First World War. So it's not the National Party that tried to regulate the profession. It was then the United Party of Smuts seeking to bring order in this consistent debate amongst accountants. Eventually, the 51 Act was passed, the Public Accountants and Auditors Act. That then gave rise to the first state-induced accounting regulation body, the PAAB. And the PAAB in its statute stated that you could only be registered with the PAAB if you are a member of one of these societies in the different provinces. By 1940, we were a union and we had provinces. So these societies from the colonial past now became societies of the provincial environments. So you could only be a member registered with the PAAB if you have been a member of that society, which means that the society would determine what exam do you write, how long do you have to be in articles of clerkship, what kind of professional qualifications they would, and what would the standards of reporting be. So then in 51, the state took control and they passed a public act which organized the profession. And then again, there were a lot of criticism because, you know, the state was open to lobbying, and different groups who were excluded from the four societies in the provinces kept on writing to the government. If you read the archives in the National Archives of South Africa in Pretoria, the archives of the Treasury, if you read those archives, you get all the letters of all the different small societies who kept writing to the minister and say, now we're excluded, you should do this to accept us, and these are our professional standards, and so forth. So although the 51 Act was passed, there was still a short window period of people who were excluded by the Act who could apply for inclusion. And once that window was closed, that was the end of it. After that, so from about 1952 onwards, these exams in collaboration with the societies in the provinces were the only exams accepted for accredited accountants, accredited chartered accountants in South Africa. So it's a long history that shows the influence of the British professional contestation in the UK South out in the South African market. And eventually it was the SIAA, the South Society of Independent Accountants and Auditors in the UK, who had the majority of the members in the South African societies, and then succeeded in getting themselves the designation chartered in the South African environment, actually just, sticking out the tongue to the ICAEW in London and saying, we now also chartered accountants and you can't stop us from using the designation. So there's a lot of British fighting in the profession that played itself out in South Africa and resulted in the landscape that we finally had since 1951.
It's such an interesting history, and thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you also for having an interest in this and making sure that there are these archives available. I'll definitely make sure to visit you and the offices next time I'm in Gauteng. I would love to see all these archives. A few comments, and I want to then get your views on them. One, it's interesting, and I think we often forget that South Africa as a republic is kind of a new invention. It's not that very old. When we talk about South Africa, we tend to think of it back to 1652, but that is not South Africa. And then we had 4 different governments in what we now know as provinces, and they were separate governments running their own things. And then there's obviously these struggles then to a decision to unify. As I did my research, so to unify in 1910, and then you have to obviously work things out, and then there's this lobbying, like you mentioned, for positioning, because it's quite lucrative to be recognized and obtain this. The second thing is the 1927 Act. It's very interesting that the societies then managed to obtain that chartered designation. Usually in the UK, when the Queen gave you a charter, I had a look at those charters of the ICAW and HSCA and CIMA. It looks to me a lot like constitutions, something like a memorandum of incorporation that we currently would file with the CIPC. So it was like an establishing document. It seems they created through a promulgation by the Queen a body corporate. It obtained a legal entity. It was basically just of a body corporate. And within that constitution, they then allowed the entity to issue this charter designation. But interestingly, if you look closely at the Privy Council, they're not a quality council. So they don't monitor or review the competencies or the quality of the ultimate candidates being produced by these chartered bodies. That is left to each entity to decide itself. A version of that doesn't really, it's not similar because it's not establishing acts, it's more like saying that if you're a member, you can get this designation. So it's interesting the 1927 Act was a designatory act, saying that only certain entities can utilize this thing. Then came 1951, and you said, the minister says this is enough, let's unify. But what I always found very strange is, why is it called the Accountants and Auditors Act? Because once it got established, it only did auditing standards and it only performed audits. What happened to the accountant side? And the reason I'm asking is, I've heard from the legislative drafters I spoke about when I did my research, actually stopped in 1983, when I wanted to know where everything started with the advent of the Close Corporation Act, which was kind of a big revolution in our corporate environment. And suddenly I had this thing called an accounting officer for a close corporation. And I wanted to know how did they come up with this word? And then I was informed by the original drafters that the word would be an accountant. And so CCs were supposed to have mandatory accountants. But then there was a position from the chartered body saying, no, you can't use accountant because it's part of the PAAB. But I could never understand because it's not really governing accounts. So, and then if I can get your responses on those 3 things, I will then ask you a follow-up question about the new South Africa, democratic South Africa, where we don't do private acts anymore, and there's an establishment of the South African Qualifications Authority kind of taking control of this professionalization. But we'll come there after you responded. Thanks, Prof.
So the four societies in the four provinces eventually established what they called a joint council and later on a national of their collaboration on a national union-wide scale, which then resulted in the States 51 Act. But on the basis of their collaboration prior to 1951, there were committees compiling some draft papers on standards of accounting and standards of auditing. So auditing and accounting standards were separate, and they were developed within the collaborative structure of the Joint and the National Council, which in 1982 then finally became the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants, SAICA, in 82. So prior to that, the profession had worked on both accounting and auditing standards. And when the PAAB came into being, it still had subcommittees working on accounting standards and on auditing standards. And what we know today as the what's its new name, the regulatory, what's it?
IRPA, the Independent
Yeah,
Regulatory Board for Auditors.
yeah, the Independent Regulatory Board. That is just for auditors. So the struggle, the turf war between SAICA and the PAAB, especially after 94, resulted in the one maintaining control over the accounting standards, accounting education, and the other one on auditing, regulating auditors and auditor standards. So the division between accounting and auditing in South Africa is a very political issue, because the chartered accountants controlled the PAB. Its board had a composition with some government officials on it, but also the professional accountants. And the composition of that professional accountant segment was always such that the members from the chartered societies in the four provinces had the majority. So, in effect, the chartered accountants controlled what happened at the PAAB. But and when finally in 82 SAICA came into being, it was actually SAICA controlling what happened at the PAAB. But when the political dispensation changed, you had a minister of finance who was very adamant that he would take political control, because the accounting profession was one of the professions that they targeted for access to people of color, and they wanted them, in terms of the entire Black economic empowerment policies, they wanted them to control, manage, and so forth. So you can't get those people controlling and managing businesses unless they're qualified. So what do you do to get them qualified? You ensure that SAICA has accepted the charter for the financial services sector, in which you have many people of color, and you have to comply with quotas of access to the profession, and so forth and so forth. So that eventually resulted in a struggle of power between SAICA and the state, because SAICA was adamant it had to control the professional standards. It had to ensure that the people were really professionally, suitably qualified to perform the very responsible task of a chartered accountant, an external auditor. So in that bickering between the state and the profession then resulted in the passing of Amendments Act in 2004, I think, of the PAAB Act, and then the new body with the new name came into being, and eventually SAICA succeeded in maintaining control over the accounting education section of the qualifying examinations. and the independent board of the regulators of the accountants maintained control over the auditing side of the professional qualification for somebody to qualify in South Africa. So the political interference into the professional development process in South Africa was strong from 1951 onwards. In 1951, the state said, I'm now going to agree to some kind of national action. But there was political interference in the quality and the decision on who gets into the profession and what the standards of qualification should be. But the political interference onwards, when the government had of getting people of color into, because access to the profession was the first step towards access to, controlling big business and so forth. So then far more political agenda played a role, because government argued that it has a mandate from the constituency to ensure that Black people, move forward into the public sphere. So that is then a completely different.
It's understandable that they would want to make that choice. We have now this constitutional democracy that for most of our history we didn't have. And introduced the Bill of Human Rights and things. The whole perspective on legislation changes, the whole nature of the legislative bodies and who you're accountable and having it reviewed and being able to make commentary on those things and have them amended. So there's a whole new dispensation happening. Parallel to what you were discussing, a smallish revolution takes place in the 1980s with the advent of the Close Corporation Act. Up until that time, South Africa only had one type of corporate legislation, the Companies Act, and all of them had to be audited. Suddenly somebody had a brainwave for the 80s. It's really innovative, saying, but what do we do? How do we corporatize and give legal recognition, a legal entity to SMEs? And up with this unique thing, the Close Corporation Act, which to this day I think we should never have cancelled in South Africa. We're working closely in Namibia and ensuring that it will continue, and Botswana has their own version of it. So maybe one day we'll be back to having a close corporation, but then they had to decide if this is a legal entity, do we need auditors for them? And the legislator comes up with this thing called an accounting officer. And the second thing is, okay, but what must this person do? Is it assurance? And they decide on a factual finding report. So there's a whole new profession being developed. Accounting officers being able to do factual findings, non-assurance, versus companies needing assurance engagement. And then a whole bunch of professional bodies starts, similar to what happened, like you explained, since 1895, with the various professional bodies in the different colonies and provinces. In 1983, it starts again with a plethora of new bodies created. Amongst them would be SAIPA, and then eventually also SAIPA, our organization, the South African Institute for Business Accountants, starting in 1987, specifically then being a membership body for accounting officers. In these two regimes, they continue up until with the revision of the Companies Act, and we modernized our Companies Act in 2008, 2010, and most we then exempt companies from the audit requirement. And with that change, there's a whole bunch of new questions being asked. Okay, what do we do now? And we introduce something called the independent review engagements. We add on to the different types of reports available. Now it's compilation, factual finding, review, and audit. And now you have to decide, how do you govern these bodies? Eventually, I think 1995, then post 94, we get the National Qualifications Framework Act, and then which regulates universities and set the quality requirements. But they then also, and I think quite uniquely, I didn't really see professional bodies being included in other National Qualification Framework Acts. They include professional bodies, establish the South African Qualifications Authority and gives them permission to set the entry criteria. Well, what it means to be a professional body and setting recognition and registration of designation. So a whole new thing develops for designations within South Africa. What also then happens since '83 is other state departments, for example, the Department of Education realizes, but we need reports for schools. And then, because the school has to keep accounting records and prepare financials, but who's going to do them for them? Who's going to do that work? And they had then this choice. Should it be an auditor versus should it be an accounting officer? And then that replicates itself within the Cooperatives Act, with the Non-Profit Organizations Act. The SABC TV license regulations provides a similar distinction, and it carries on. So eventually there was then this 9 or 10 pieces of legislation, and this is where we're currently sitting within our own accounting profession. There's no real unity, different standards, different types of reports for similar entities, but under different government departments. And what we've been trying to do is to get that committee, like you said, they started in the 1920s, kind of to replicate and set that up again. So that is that's also happening on the side of what you were sharing, and why I found it so interesting. There's so much parallels happening. Between please, Prof.
Can I just say? Can I say that the professional action by the societies in the provinces to get themselves recognized, of course, was the recognition of the professional accountant as the most important or the professional accountant. There were always people doing accounting work of different levels and with different degrees of sophistication, from the top to the bottom down. And then, as you have now explained, from the 1980s onwards and the decision on the Closed Corporation Act, accounting functions on different levels were gradually gaining ground. And that was actually what the accountants who tried to get into the chartered designation in 27, they were arguing exactly that they are also forming functions. It's on a lower scale, but perhaps less sophisticated, but it's also and makes a contribution to society and business development and transparency and so forth. But the critical mass was too small to really impact on government. But in the 1980s, you can see that the diversification of the South African economy and a very significant role mandated a better recognition of, and therefore it made sense to provide, apart from the chartered accounting profession, a differentiation of qualifications on a scale that would incorporate different people. And eventually we find that some also try to organize accounting technicians and so forth, and they finally let that go, and it went into more professional separate organizations. But the whole range of accounting functions, from the very elementary at the bottom to the most sophisticated of the chartered accountant, were always present in South Africa, organized and institutionalized. And as post 1980s, and they became more institutionalized and organized. And then after 94, when the government had the agenda of Black economic empowerment, to then it was important to consolidate the operations on different levels, because they would then provide access to people on different levels and satisfy the aspirations of people to work in accounting, but not really wanting to be a chartered accountant, not being interested in that or not being able to achieve that, whatever the case may be. And then finally, 2013 Companies Act, as amended from 2008 onwards, that act then very clearly statutorily provide for the different levels of accounting expertise required for different structures of business organizations. And that is really, really giving effect to what historically had happened, because that's the way laws work. Statutes are always ex post facto. The development occurs and then finally it's formalized in an act. So the act in 2013 was really giving effect to what was a very broad spectrum of accounting activity in South Africa.
I like what you said. There's first the development and then the statute. But I would then
Follows.
argue that the development continues, and that's why I suppose there's continuous revision of acts and what needs to be updated. So the statute doesn't set the final norm. It's very dynamic, and it's a social science, so it continuously develops. And an interesting development in the Companies Act that they don't, for most companies, they don't require any type of accountant to support. It's not prescribed or mandated. The standard is you should follow a IFRS or IFRS for SME or accounting policy as appropriate. But there's no person prescribed on who can do that work for you in a compilation or report. The audit is only for the very few companies. Like I would estimate 10 to 5% of companies is mandated to do audits if you look at the numbers. And now the question is, the professional that's allowed to perform this function is not prescribed within an act, and it is basically currently left to the market to decide. The public or the business person, they can then freely decide which type of accountant I'm going to use. And with that development, as you prescribed, of splitting accounting and auditing, currently the Financial Reporting Standards Council within the Companies Act is not a regulator. It's more like an advisor to the minister. And it's been mandated to advise the minister on what standards to adopt, not which standard must be prescribed. And they don't prescribe them. They basically just advisory. So it's a very interesting setup that Parliament has given to the business community in having to now figure this thing out by itself, and who is then the most competent accountant to perform this function. And that is history being developed as we speak, because we kind of re-lobbying again back in the 1950s. But considering the word chartered, I want your view on this. Traditionally, historically, I suppose it originated in the UK, because that was the way. They didn't have company law back in 1500. So how did they establish an entity? It has to be the sovereign issuing some edict or resolution. Later on, with the Industrial Revolution, that's changed. We get company law, and now everybody, part of democracy, can register their company and technically be chartered, because you get this act. And there's this whole ceremonial view of chartered, because the Privy Council still manages those charters, and some entities want to obtain this, even though it's not a quality council. I then thought that if we continue the thinking along the line of decolonization, and Africa's independence kind of only happened in the 1940s, 50s, so that's about 75, 80 years ago, Africa got independence. South Africa, you could argue 1994. But so as we are developing our own independent thought, our own policies, and finding ourselves in the world, what do you think is the role of our own royal families? Because in Limpopo we've got 12 kings, and I think in Eastern Cape there's 7 traditional royal kings, and we all know the Zulu king. As an organization, we thought they kind of neglected within the business community. And is there not a way, in a similar fashion, that you would get a charter as a ceremonial recognition from the Queen of England, or the King now? Would that not be a symbolic development within South Africa to ask our own traditional leaders to offer you this charter? We've been engaging with them, and it seems that they do feel not as if they've received a proper recognition, as I suppose, especially with the Khoisan, you could argue them to be the first peoples. I've noted developments in Australia and in the US with recognition, giving recognition to first peoples. Do you see that a charter can play such a unifying role?
Yeah, this is speculation, and my personal opinion is that it would really add very little to the quality of account, transparency, and accountability in the. It's just a political gesture, and in Australia, it is. I know in Australia, it is just an overwhelming political gesture with absolutely substance. It's just playing politics, it's arguments. So I wouldn't be, from a professional point of view, arguing that it can add any value to the quality of work that's being done in the accounting across the entire range of accounting functions in South Africa. My personal view would be that the professionals should focus on the professional work and the quality of their work, and negotiate with the standards body in South Africa about standards to ensure that you have good quality work and that you don't have things like VBS, where chartered accountants, some of them qualify from the University of Johannesburg, being involved in such corruption, and across the board in government departments. So that would be my focus. So personally, I wouldn't say that this symbolic recognition can really add any value to the quality of accounting, which is actually what it should be all about. But on the question of decolonization, I also think it's become a very loaded political woke argument, because in essence, if there is the so-called decolonization of accounting, we should stop doing the accounting that it comes from Britain. The accounting as a profession, the way compiled, audited, and so forth, that comes from Britain. It simply is the case that the British introduced that. In the French colonial environment, they introduced the way that the French compiled their accounts. Up to today, it's not Cameroonian, it is French standards that are being applied and then adjusted to a degree to the business environment of the Ivory Coast or Equatorial Africa or Cameroon. So it's a political argument, this whole decolonization thing. It doesn't change the substance. In substance, what the accountants are doing is writing up, as they were taught, what should be in a financial report, how should you audit, what should be reconciled, what must be transparent, what do you have to declare. These are, you can't decolonize that. What can be done is that it can be adapted to local circumstances, as the Indians are doing, the accountants in India. And in Africa, this should increasingly happen if there's good argument for adapting the international financial reporting standards to local environments. You must remember that even up to today, not all the Americans do not wholeheartedly support IFRS. So it's not globally wide accepted. It means that even in a sophisticated economy such as the American, there are accounting practices that they find more suitable than the IFRS. So adapting a general standard is actually what the accountant should. How can a standard really support an enterprise to do better business, be transparent to people who want to collaborate with them through shareholding, investment, work with them, and in that fashion, ultimately promoting economic development? Because in the last instance is to ensure good business for stronger economic development. So all the other ideological things are nominal, to my personal opinion. and would not necessarily serve the interest of good accounting practice.
So you raise another point of quality and competence within the way we set standards and the ultimate goal of standards.
Yeah.
But I think with the colonization argument, the decolonization argument has value for me, and I agree it can be politicized, and there is a woke element to it, like you expressed, is that if I look at the current setup at the IFRS Foundation, it is most funded by the US, I think the UK and China. South Africa has a very negligible contribution to the IFRS Foundation. And then there's a clear, like in all international structures, political elements within the way the standards are set. I think there's good research behind that, how if you could influence a standard, it might have a marginal effect on your economy, but that margin can be quite big. Or it could be more lenient to your own business or your company. So what I do find useful of the decolonizing argument is, let me use an example. I went to the Financial Reporting Standards Council and I asked them, who do we send to, who does South Africa send to represent us at the IFRS Foundation when we discuss these standards? And what mandate do we give that person? And the question could not be understood by the FRSC. They assume it's a technical question and you would send a technical person. But surely the person that you send is representing South Africa, is representing our parliament and the policies we make, and hence must ensure that whatever standards are discussed and influenced, it benefits our country, whether it's a delayed application, or whether it's a different application, or whether it's an exemption. And I really found a strong support for that approach, looking at how China and India does it. Whereas given our own colonial past, historically, and I think it's well researched also, that South Africa just blindly adopts whatever the foundation would issue. Even now, it's a wholesale adoption. There's no critical analysis. And that to me is, I think, with decolonizing becomes a strong motivator to say, wait a minute, we are an independent country. What do we want to do with this standard? And that then moves into our second part of the role of universities. I really, and I think that is also your second paper that we want to touch on, and that is the independence of universities and the overpowering influence of professional bodies on universities. And that to me is also, in a sense, a decolonizing, because in a way that the university needs to rediscover its own independence for the sake of proper science and proper uninfluenced results, so that we can see how we should do things. And we need universities to do that. But universities must play, for me, a stronger role at how standards are set. There should be much more alignment with India and China and how they view things. And we really, I can't for the life of me understand how we would do a wholesale adoption of IFRS. The argument usually is now it will give you foreign direct investment. But then there's research that says even if you didn't adopt it, FDI will still come. So there's a whole analysis needed. Is it really the standard that's bringing it? Is it really good governance that's bringing it? Or is it other economic factors that brings FDI? And then resetting the true role of accounting and standards and auditing standards. And that's, I think, where the universities are missing a beat. And what I would love to see, a more independent, a more rigorous university that's self-sustaining and self-focused. But let's go back to you and the research you explain that paper, and then also the premise of it and why you decided to focus on university independence.
The focus on the independence of accounting academics, accounting scientists, was because what I observed at my institution was a complete lack thereof. There are people appointed because they are brilliant minds, very intelligent, wonderful people, but they're technical accountants. They are so bright in applying all standards and they know it off by heart. So they're brilliant technically, but they're not independent intellectuals. And they never try even to penetrate the international scholarly discourse on the foundations of certain principles in accounting, or the rationale foundation for the role of a professional as opposed to a technician, or the role of the profession in social and economic development. But that I found at the university was a very strong focus on all the technicalities. Why? Because you must pass the exam. And once you pass the exam, the university gets, acclaimed. This institution has passed this many chartered accountants. And then, by the way, the academics get a specific subvention, which is partly determined by the numbers that they churn out into the profession. So there are far too many other determinants apart from independent scientific academic requirements for your conduct at the institution that mandated people's behavior as lecturers at the university. Sometimes I was reluctant to call them academics because they are just lecturing the technical stuff that is prescribed in the syllabi by the professional body and ensure that people pass that. But there's intellectual in dynamics. So if you leave that aside and you go back to the nature of a university, it is supposed to be an institution of intellectual excellence and of an open, critical mind, challenging positions, arguing about alternatives, testing alternatives, not prescribed by the technicalities of a professional body, but testing alternatives in terms of the intellectual discourse, and intellectual discourse being determined globally. So many of the accountants publishing review or the European Accounting Review are engaged in discourses that the people at our universities don't even take account of. They don't even know that they're going on. They don't publish in those journals. They never attend those international conferences where they are subject views to international intellectual scrutiny. So the whole reason why a university exists is something very different from the practice of departments of accounting, of accountancy at South African universities. Now, of course, where we are now in the second or almost the third decade of the 21st century, there are some departments of accountancy that have started to move in the direction of international intellectual academic discourse, such as Victoria, but not have done that because they're so comfortable in their position. They are appointed with the blessing of the professional body. They get subventions from the professional body, and their task is to churn out the numbers. They not engage in the critical open mind analysis of the theory and the thinking behind the technical stuff. And that is where the accounting profession can actually make a much greater contribution to social and economic progress wherever they operate, because they penetrate the problematics of the environment intellectually and challenge the ideas of the technicians, and in that sense can make a major contribution to what we have just been talking about, namely adopting certain technical standards to certain specific contexts more efficiently.
Now, your issues that you raise make me so excited because that to me is what I understand on decolonization. Because there has to be a reason, and it might be a misapplied theory, but or misunderstanding on my part, but you said intellectual versus technical. And I think that is so crucial. The university should be intellectually hubs where there is open and free discussion along proper scientific methods, and but an intellectual rigor that constantly asks questions. And that to me is decolonization, because something caused universities to act in this way. To me, there's a dominancy power play thesis that somebody can do. It's an interest of mine. I think one should analyze it, how powers affect the structure of the university and the outcome. And the best way I can describe it is to decolonize and to say we're independent. Let's do this the proper way.
But
and then
may I?
How much? Mm-hmm.
May I just suggest that the term decolonization has a specific meaning. It means to move away from the colony. Whereas through the centuries of university work, independent critical discourse is exactly what it says. It's independent critical discourse. We don't have to have the word connected to colonization, which has a specific meaning to explain to us what independent intellectual work we have to do. So what I'm really trying to argue is that the woke argument against colonies and colonization should rather be continued in another sphere. It's not really the place of the university to enter that debate. What the universities should do is be true to themselves as institutions. And universities are institutions since the Renaissance era, when we moved out of the Middle Ages. They are institutions of independent intellectual excellence. And that is the nature of the university that should be carried forward. And we don't need the decolonization argument, because that is tainted with a woke agenda. If we just teach our scholars, to be critical analysts, to be wide open minds, then we achieve what we want to. And then an individual is that in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, where there's no colonization. Europe wasn't colonized, but they still perform these intellectual works at functions at the universities. So it's just my penny's worth of comment on the use of that specific.
I think it needs further exploration. What's been helpful to me is what Steve Biko wrote when he said decolonization of the mind. It might not be a decolonization in a political sense, but then definitely in a thinking process. Now, but talking about your article, your research further, what is the harm that can come if a university does not do the intellectual approach? And my theory again is we've seen a lot of state capture. I think we must hold the world record for the amount of damage that we can cause our own economy with state capture. I think our GDP would have been double what it is now if that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned the VBS scandal, there's the Steinhoff scandal, there's the scandals of the Big Four not doing their work. So it's massive fraud, misreporting that's happening. And like you mentioned, accountants are right in the center. And after this whole affair, and I think we need a real reassessment of what truly happened within our profession, on what caused this. My contribution would be to look at this technical approach that you mentioned. That's a real threat to an economy. If everybody is so technical, they can't see the wood for the trees, because they can't have an intellectual critical mind to see what's happening actually in front of them. Just your view on that.
Yeah. So the alternative that we suggest in our article is really that the role of the academic at the university should be independent of any professional body. They should not be in their pockets in any way, and thereby, through the independent critical approach, teach scholars to take that same stance, which means that the benefit for the entire economy is that you send out qualified people who are intellectually independent in the practical environment where they occur, where they confront empirical problems, new sets of circumstances. They're intellectually able to analyze, think about a solution, and suggest a solution that's sound, rational, well thought through, and perhaps maybe innovative. Because the type of problems that an environment might confront are not necessarily the same as the previous one. So there are new circumstances. So I, as a historian, have learned from history that certain trends have manifested themselves, certain uh, conjunction of factors led to certain outcomes, but that's never set. It changes in every environment. Everything, every new context is unique and dynamic. So if the independent intellectual development is nurtured rather than the regurgitation of the text, do I know all of these things by heart? And if I get the question, can I churn them out? Rather than that, develop the independent intellectual analytical faculties of the rational mind. Then you train accountants who are able to confront new issues in the practical environment. See, as you say, the wood for the trees, and move beyond just applying the recipe that they were taught at universities, but act intellectually um, uh, uh, um, active, intellectually free, and intellectually sharp, where they can see different from the rule that I've come across. And if I take into account this theory and that theory, and think about it critically, then maybe I could suggest this way out of the problem, for which there might not necessarily be a rule. But now you have in Africa, for example, the emergence of a whole host of small business enterprises. You need accountants to help thinking through how could these new enterprises be formalized? How could they be assisted with new ways of keeping their accounts, somebody checking up, some form of regulation so that they can grow? In my research as a business historian on African business, I see very, very, very few small enterprises going through to the medium stage or going through one generation to the next. So they die with the person who started them. So this is the type of problems that our specific environment present us. Now, intellectually sharp and intelligent should penetrate these issues, use their theoretical knowledge to come up with new solutions, motivate people to act in a different way, to make their businesses more viable, and so forth. So I don't want to say that I have all the answers, but the argument of intellectual, critical, rational education is really nurturing the leadership of the future rather than teaching people to regurgitate the rules and just write them down off by heart. So many students say, I just can't pass this accounting exam because I have to learn too much off by heart, and I just don't learn things off by heart. I understand them, and I critically assess theories. And that's ways of looking at education.
No, it is totally different. I think Elon Musk, there was a TikTok of him saying exactly what you're saying, in how you should approach education, and that is more like an experiential learning rather than starting with theoretical. But I think it's a self-fulfilling thing, because once you establish these technical people within universities, they want to perpetuate themselves, how they are in Singapore.
Of course.
They would then create these students that look like them, and then those are the ones that end up in the profession, and then you have this restricted innovation, because it can't innovate itself, and hence why you need an independent structure. So professional bodies shouldn't dominate universities shouldn't dominate professional bodies. Each one has its role, and we need to protect that, otherwise you get an economic collapse.
Well, you see, well, if you look at for example, in Australia, you don't write your qualifying examination through the university. You get your basic education there, and then to qualify, you do it through your institute. And the same in the UK. People can come from different bachelor's environment. People come from science bachelor's background, and then they write the professional qualification through the professional body, which is right. But it should not be that much as it's sanctioned in the South African context. But this is an axe I have to grind with the institute for a long time, and I don't assume going forward.
But we've been building our own institutes much along the line that you prescribed, in that we call it a modular development. Becoming an accountant in 20-year process. It can't be something that you do within 4 years, and then because you qualified an exam, you are now this thing. It's so specialized. For example, accounting for agriculture, we've developed into a license. So it's not part of a curriculum, but if you want to specialize in that area, you'd rather do a separate license. And then we've built this whole. We actually saw it when there's a statistic that says 70% of listed company CFOs are CASAs. But then I looked at the statistic and thought, but who's the other 30%? And how come a listed company appoints a non-CA as a CFO? And then when we saw this, it supports your argument that there's engineering, actuaries, marketing managers, I think, all CFOs. And then when you go to the US and Europe, the statistics is the other way around. Only 30% has a CPA as a CFO. But most are non. And that we really then internalized it as a professional body to say, but how do you define an accountant? Is it something that somebody studied, or is it a job title that he performs? Because if an employer employs somebody that studies, let's say, teaching as their accountant, then how, as a body, can I say they're not wrong? I can assist them becoming more professional, and I can clarify their work methods and constantly improve the standards that they apply. But I cannot say, no, you're not part of the profession. So we've really been trying to democratize the profession, what it means. Not saying you have to be a member of a body to be an accountant. It cannot be true, but it has its own challenges, and this is where we need independent thought from universities to think this through, because now you have a multiverse of entry criteria and entry points that you must consider. And we've been struggling with that now. So in this world now, how does a final exam look? Is it testing accounting standards, or is it replicating reality? In other words, how do people apply standards? They don't know them by heart. If you have to apply something, it's then that you kind of engage with it. And then there's these team members that you work with, your specialist IFRS, your auditors, your financial advisors, and then you formulate an idea. So it's an interesting development within the profession, and I think this conversation has really helped me personally, and we'll definitely have a future engagement. But then just one last question, just coming back to the traditional leaders and us seeking a role charter from them. For us, it's trying to move to what you were saying, to say, yes, there's a technical aspect of accounting, but it has to be grounded in community, in culture, and in ethical values. And it was our kind of way to say, but can we not forget these traditional values when we do accounting? Because if you think about it, what damage you can cause as a CFO, well, concrete representation of what it means to be ethical. Because you act within a community on the one hand, and on the other hand, to actually give recognition to the traditional leaders and the role they play. I think we saw that with the 30% of South Africa's population live in rural areas. And generally they are excluded from economic activity. And now you have to see why this is, and maybe it's because of not being fully recognized by the business community. And there's a way that you can make them part of a formal economy by elevating their own standing. And that on the one hand, and on the other, as I said, it will give us a very real connection to what it means to act ethically and responsibly as accountants. So I suppose much like the Queen, they're not setting the quality assurance standards, that's done by SACWA. We would then ask this of the world leaders, and that's kind of we want to develop South Africa's independent voice, like you said, there's intellectual capacity. But there's then many ways in which you have to do this. One way is to get universities to be fully independent, the other is to say, but wait a minute, to whose benefit do we act? South Africa's economy, Africa's the West, do we take the American view, do we take the Asian view? What is our approach? And that, I suppose, comes with a broader metaphysical and then eventually framework, and then the theory, and then the practice of accounting. So what is that overarching theme that's going to inform your response? And that's kind of what we're trying to build and why we press traditional leaders. So that is the comment I wanted to make, and then I wanted to get your feedback on it before we close.
I think it is important to have a better rapport between traditional leaders and business, because the way traditions in their diversity, they're not the same across the country. The Zulu people and the Venda people and the Khoi people all have different values and different approaches. So the rapport between them and business, where we would argue business would have access to accounting and perform accounting reports so that they are transparent. That is a very important connection to make. Whether you're going to achieve that with some kind of symbolic charter or accountant, I don't know whether that's going to be the case. But what is important is that the way business is conducted generally as an individual or as groups of people trying to generate wealth, generate a surplus so that they could use that profit to build the enterprise or expand their operations. That usually has potential conflict with the traditional leader acting in a more communal way, or that traditional leader argue that he is the authority and everybody else needs to get his blessing before they act. So that is a problem, the way that an operates. So to mitigate these differences, collaboration or negotiations or standing bodies where you could talk to the traditional leaders of how do they support and engage with the private enterprise of individuals wanting to grow their enterprises, that can be useful. In which format you give that effect is something that you will probably be far better to argue than I am. But I know in my work on the development of business in Africa that the different contexts of different traditions and different cultures impact on the development of private enterprise, and that being solved or worked out in different environments. It's more successful than in others. We see massive growth in good support by good policies for small enterprise in Kenya and in Ethiopia, but not that well in Tanzania. So the contexts are so different, and what kind of negotiation you have to do with traditional leaders varies. It's a very dynamic environment, but that there is need to engage more effectively with that environment, I would agree.
Prof, this was an amazing discussion with you. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think I'm an intellectual at heart, and your papers just spoke to an interest that I had now for quite a long time. It made my own profession more clear for me. The light is definitely clearer after our discussion. I hope our audience enjoyed it. It was quite lengthy, but definitely worthwhile. Any final remarks from you, Prof, and then we can just close our podcast.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk to you. I would just suggest that some people read more systematically into the publications of accounting history. There are different accounting history journals where the application of accounting technology within context historically are discussed, and that really addresses the issues that we have now discussed. You'll see in the journal Accounting History, Accounting History Perspectives, Accounting Organization and Society. In these journals, you will find a lot of literature that would address the contextual issues that we discussed here. And that might be a way of continuing your inquiry and further debates.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you very much, Prof, for the career that you chose and for providing us with this insightful research. If you didn't do it, we still would have known what was the developing the profession, and then we'll still be grappling in the dark. So thank you very much for the amazing work you did in your career. And then to my audience, thank you for listening and sharing this very interesting podcast. And I hope this has changed your life and maybe give you a new perspective on running your practice, or if you're an academic. Yes, let's embrace intellectualism over just technical knowledge. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Prof.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
What do our defining moments look like? Just like this moment right now. They look like pride after achieving that long sought-after goal. All the small victories along the way that didn't feel momentous until we saw them in the rearview mirror. They look like the courage it takes to take that first big step. All the times we fail and rise again. And without even knowing it, cultivating an inner strength that is contagious along the way. They look like the inspiration that comes from knowing that we are not alone. They look like the human relationships that give us wisdom beyond what data ever could. They look like the curiosity that comes from exploring, that allow us to create and contribute. They look like education that unlocks our full potential, using our knowledge for impact. They look like choosing our own definition of success, over hiding, over hustling, over pretending. They look like others showing up and recognizing our efforts after all the times we already showed up for ourselves. They look like being bold enough to be extraordinary. They look like you. Right now, right here. First, we help you see your defining moments. Then we help you seize them. We are the accounting body for everyone. We are the